In this session, we're going to look at neoliberalism and class power. The geographer David Harvey, in his book A Brief History of Neoliberalism, looks at the trend of neoliberalism that over the last 4 decades has come to have a major impact on the societies, politics and economies of countries around the globe. Neoliberalism has involved privatization, or the shifting of resources away from the public sector towards the private sector. It's involved deregulation, it's involved free trade, or the forcing open of trade barriers for often wealthier, richer countries to trade with poorer countries, and a host of other political and economic changes. Harvey's main argument is that the purpose of this conglomeration of different policies known as global neoliberal restructuring has been to restore class power and wealth to upper classes and elites. Often people who study neoliberalism say that one of the biggest changes we see after the implementation of neoliberal policies is a massive increase in wealth differentials. And Harvey argues that this social inequality is not just a byproduct of neoliberal reforms, but it's actually the point of them. So let's look at a timeline of neoliberalism. Where did it come from? How did it start? So the 1960s was the heyday of what was known as Keynesianism. This was an economic and social policy followed by most advanced capitalist nations as well as third world countries. And it was a set of policies that relied on a very strong state sector, high taxation to ensure greater redistribution of wealth, and state-led programs, industrialization-heavy programs. At this time, there was an economist known as Milton Friedman who was based in Chicago at the Chicago School of Economics, and he put forward a counter theory which said that we need to drastically pare back the role of the state. We need to give free market enterprise a much greater role in the economy. But at this time, Milton Friedman was and the others around him in the Chicago School of Economics was still a minority in terms of economic thought. So during this period of the 60s and into the 70s, Milton Friedman began training a new generation of economists, and some of these economists went to universities in Chile, and they started propagating this idea of free market economics as being a very important way to move forward. And they finally got their chance. In 1973, the radical populist president Salvador Allende in Chile was overthrown by a coup, and the general Augusto Pinochet came into power, and he used this as an opportunity to partner with Friedman acolytes and others in order to put in a right-wing experiment to try out neoliberal policy. And during the period of the 70s and 80s, to varying degrees, we see the emergence and the coming to power of dictatorships, some of whom employed elements also of these neoliberal policies. And so we see as a trend the initial implementation of neoliberal policy happening through violent means such as coups. Now, in 1982, we see a big debt crisis happening across Latin America from countries having borrowed money, and the collapse in oil prices and other factors leading to massive debt in these countries. And so the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, these international financial institutions, came in and said, we will rescue your economies, we will loan you the money, we will help you we will give you loans, but you have to employ these structural adjustment policies. So structural adjustment policies are the same kind of policies that Milton Friedman was talking about, that Pinochet applied in Chile after the coup, the same getting rid of the public sector, drastically downsizing the public sector, giving much more rein to free market, reducing taxes, basically reducing the redistributive role of the state in favor of a more punitive role for the state. And so these Latin American nations were told that in order to get support and to get bailed out by these banks, they would have to apply structural adjustment measures. So just like with the example of the coup, again, we see in the case of the debt crisis that neoliberalism is being imposed through force and through coercion. In 1985 is when we begin to see these policies that were first applied in the global south, in Chile and Latin America and the Southern Cone. We begin to see them applied in capitalist advanced capitalist economies such as Britain and the United States. And so in 1985, the Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in Britain began to talk about the ownership society, that everybody can be a little capitalist, everybody can own their own home, that they can see themselves not as workers, not as citizens, but they can see themselves as entrepreneurs. And this is similar to Reaganomics in the US. When Ronald Reagan was elected, he began talking about trickle-down theory, saying that we need to focus on opening up the economy, strengthening the economy at the top, and if corporations can make great profits, this will eventually trickle down to the poorer and lower classes. And so it's in this period of 1985 that we begin to see these policies being applied in first world countries as well. In 1989, a lot of these tenets of neoliberal policy that had been applied sometimes sporadically or sometimes as part of a radical agenda, like in Chile, or with the structural adjustment policies, we begin to see these policies described in a more coherent way. And this happens with the economist John Williamson in what he called the Washington Consensus. He put together a series of 10 points that outline the tax reforms, the privatization, the deregulation, all of the elements that constituted these free market reforms, and they became to be known widely as a Washington Consensus because these are the policies that were gaining favor within Washington, within the political sphere, and that were being applied within the country and also abroad as standard features of neoliberal policy. And then later on, after this, we see the changes taking place, first in Poland with the free market revolution, away from the communist system and towards a free market system. And that heralds then various other revolutions across the Soviet Empire that lead in the end to the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the neoliberal revolution of Boris Yeltsin and the coming to power of neoliberal leaders who carry out there as well neoliberal revolutions. So David Harvey looks at these years of neoliberal policy in terms of various stages. So in the 1970s, he says that Keynesianism had actually reached a point of serious crisis of capital accumulation, whether it was debt crisis or whether it was simply workers pushing to demand a greater share of corporate profits and corporations not being willing to give those, and so in the 1970s, capitalism reaches a certain point of crisis, and there are certain ways we see. One way of dealing with that as the socialist or communist path, and another way of dealing with that is Milton Friedman's path of neoliberalism, and that's what we end up seeing as getting applied. And so in the 1980s, as described, we see various uneven neoliberal strategies being applied, being tested out, either wholesale or piecemeal in various ways. But by the 1990s, we see a fairly strong consolidation of the neoliberal model under even liberal and democratic governments, but we still see these various governments taking on board the Washington Consensus, taking on board these various aspects, paring down the state, reducing taxes and reducing the impact of the public sector so that welfare becomes a much smaller section of the economy, that private enterprise is given a greater support. Then in the 2000s, we see a slight shift to what Harvey calls the neoconservative solution. And this refers to the sort of coalescing around a moral alternative, which often relies on conservative evangelical Christianity, family values, conservative values, and is exemplified in the figure of the American president, the younger George Bush, who comes into office and who promotes this neoconservative solution as a further consolidation of the neoliberal model. So how was class power transformed and then restored under neoliberalism? So Keynesianism reached a crisis. There was a crisis of profitability among the capitalist classes and corporations, and neoliberalism helped to restore class power and helped to restore that redistribution of wealth upwards. How did that happen? Well, David Harvey gives us various reasons. He says, well, there was an acceleration of open financialization in the 1990s, so a shift away from the industrialization that had marked those Keynesian years towards the financial capital that gained a lot more importance in the 1990s. There was the increasing geographical mobility of capital. So instead of basing, say, factory production all in one factory or in one city, we begin to see that being dispersed across the globe. And so various aspects in the production chain happen in Southeast Asia or in Mexico or across the globe, and we begin to see a dispersal of capital in order to increase its profitability. We see the Wall Street, IMF, Treasury complex that comes to dominate economic policy. So it is these kind of these bodies, these financial bodies, that begin to hold much greater sway over decisions being made in the political sphere. And then we see the powerful ideological influence of a new monetarist and neoliberal economic orthodoxy. And all of these come together as the Washington Consensus of the mid-1990s. So what exactly does class power refer to when we say that the profitability was declining, and in order to renew that, elites pursued strategies of neoliberalism in order to renew their power? We're not always talking about the same groups. In fact, in some places we see that the older industrial elites, particularly in third world countries, in the global south, that these industrial elites often, in the shift to free market economies, often lost out and often had to close down. And what we see is it's global conglomerates who begin to have a much greater hegemonic impact within the global economy. So there's a restoration. So there's a restoration of power, sometimes to the same groups, but sometimes what we're seeing is newly emerging elites who are different to the older elites. But at the same time, both global and US elites drove the spread of neoliberal ideas and profited from them, together with regional elites in various other global south countries. So Harvey and others have talked about neoliberalism as a set of state policies. They've said it's these economic policies. They've looked at it as an ideology that restores class power, that restores profitability. But others, such as when the political theorist Wendy Brown, have sought to provide a different way of looking at neoliberalism, particularly in the more contemporary era where force is not as important of an element in the ways that neoliberalism has spread. So Wendy Brown draws on the work of Michel Foucault, and she says, well, as well as looking at neoliberalism as policies and as economic policies and ideology, we can also understand it as a governing rationality that extends certain economic values and metrics to every dimension of human life. So while, as we looked at in that timeline, neoliberalism initially was imposed through coups and through force and through coercion in the 1970s and 80s, in Western capitalist countries today, it's often enacted more through techniques of neoliberal governance or soft power. Wendy Brown argues that this neoliberal rationality extends the model of the market to all domains, even to non-economic domains. And so people are reconfigured as market actors under the neoliberal model, that they're constantly competing with each other to increase their rankings, to showcase their brand. And we're all encouraged to think of ourselves as individual brands who are constantly trying to market ourselves. And what are some examples of this? Well, online dating, we may think of online dating as a non-economic domain. It's not directly related to fiscal policy. But Wendy Brown argues that people are encouraged to even approach something like dating as if they're an entrepreneur or they're an investor. So they need to maximize their returns on the output of emotion that they put into the process. Another example that Wendy Brown gives is social media followers and likes and retweets. The ways in which people interact on social media mean that every activity is constantly being ranked and rated. So even something we might see as going onto Facebook or posting something on Instagram, we might just see that as part of our everyday leisure or consumption activities. But Wendy Brown says that it's actually an example of the ways in which neoliberal rationality is operating in our lives. Looking for likes, trying to get retweets, trying to increase our rankings, that even what is conceived of as non-economic leisure activities still get drawn into this neoliberal rationality. So who is the contemporary subject of neoliberal governance? Well, and how does that compare to what Karl Marx talked about? Now, he described the subject of revolutionary action, if you'll recall, as the proletariat. For Marx, the proletariat was this collective subject who engaged in class struggle. Under neoliberalism, Brown says, well, the dominant subject now is an entrepreneur, or they're a market actor, someone who's constantly calculating to increase their ranking, trying to enhance the future value of their self. So what is the impact of this? The impact is that in a neoliberal era, labor disappears as a category. So we don't have workers anymore. There are only entrepreneurs. If you think back to the other week when we talked about the gig economy and how taxi drivers, for instance, are not seen as workers, they're configured as independent contractors. And when we look at people as individual entrepreneurs in this way rather than as the collective of workers, then we're not able to talk and think about class. We're not able to theorize alienation and exploitation in the way that Marx did with thinking about the industrial factory. We don't have an analytical basis for understanding and coming together in order to contest and to protest neoliberalism. And this is one of the issues that exists in this modern era, is that the neoliberal subject itself makes it difficult to come together and think about forms of collective resistance. So what might be some of the limitations of the Foucauldian approach, especially if we want to come up with anti-neoliberal strategies, if we want to challenge neoliberalism, what might be some of the limitations of using a Foucauldian approach of neoliberal rationality to try to understand these changes? So in thinking about each person as little capitals who are seeking to maximize their individual gains, while this is a fruitful approach for understanding how neoliberalism reconfigures people and reconfigures workers as entrepreneurs and as individuals, it still makes it difficult to understand why sometimes individuals do come together in class-based movements and unions, despite the fact that under neoliberalism they're encouraged to think of themselves as little capitals, as an ownership society. Nevertheless, they do sometimes still organize in unions. And with the Foucauldian approach, we don't really have a way of theorizing that. In this Foucauldian approach, there isn't the importance of capital as a social and historical force is denied a role in class formation and subject production. And then what about the internal contradictions of neoliberalism itself? How can we think about those? How might theorizing those contradictions allow us to move beyond the hegemonic paradigm? For instance, how can we think about the anti-neoliberal leaders who came to power in Latin America and what was known as the Pink Wave, or even say the 2019 Chilean uprisings? There are collective protests, there are ways in which people continue to come together, continue to protest, and one of the limitations of the neoliberal rationality is that it doesn't always allow us to understand that. So probably a more fruitful approach would be one that thinks about neoliberal rationality together while drawing on the insights of Harvey's class-based approach, where we can understand the importance of capital and how it has changed over time, where we can understand the broader class strategies of this moment.